So first I want to talk about just some basic things about cutting. The first thing I guess we should talk about are materials. You're going to need straight pins, you're going to need glue. This is Elmer's glue, but we said before we would encourage you to use some kind of craft glue like Sobo. It's more flexible is the reason. This, when it dries, is really hard and it cracks, and then if you flex something that is glued with Elmer's glue, when it flexes, it cracks and then it's not very strong anymore. So I'm going to use a pen, but you guys probably should use a light pencil when you're kind of sketching out what you're going to cut. This is probably the most important thing, is to have extra blades. The first thing I did when I brought all this stuff in this morning was change and put a new blade in. You'll need to change blades frequently, so if you don't have a whole package of extra blades, get one. And then it will also be helpful to have a ruler. I don't have one with me this morning for some reason. I do have a triangle. If you've got a 45-degree triangle, that might be helpful to you as well. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. So, a few things about cutting. First of all, you want to slice and not like chop, right? So you want to not stand the blade up and drag it through. You want to lay it down and slowly pull it through and slice through. So if I try to do it this way, I have to really push hard and I don't get a very clean cut. It's kind of hard to see, but you can see it's kind of ragged and the edge stands up. But if you lay it down pretty close to more horizontal, you can slice through much more cleanly, right? Now, with a new blade, you can make it in one pass for a shortcut. Usually, though, you're going to want to have a straight edge if it's a straight cut and make several passes. So that's the first note, make several passes. Cut through the surface paper, cut through the foam, get back in that same track, cut through the paper on the other side, and you'll end up with a pretty clean cut. All right? Let me see if I can zoom out a little bit here. My hands get really huge, right? Okay, so cut with your arm and not with your fingers. And what I mean by that is that you don't want to really like move your hand and your fingers as you cut. You don't want to like inchworm your way across the paper like this, right? That just does not get you a very clean line, as you can see. Instead, use your whole arm. And I like to actually stand up when I'm doing these kind of large cuts. You have your hand kind of locked together. Maybe you've got a straight edge. You're really cutting by flexing your bicep, pulling your whole arm back. So this all is one stiff movement. This is like, think of this as like one tool that's all together, right? So that will be helpful in getting clean cuts. Like I said, use a straight edge when possible. It is sometimes helpful to draw things out with a ruler and a light pencil. I'm using a pen so you can see it better, but I would use a pencil if I was sketching out shapes to cut. Now, for cutting curved pieces, that's a little bit trickier. And the tighter the curve, the harder it is. But again, I think it's helpful to stand up and to move your whole arm. And sometimes you have to take more than one pass. And the second pass or the third pass has to be much more slowly so that you stay in the line. Okay? If you want to cut something really tiny, you've got to have a really sharp blade and just use the point. And you have to do it very slowly and carefully. And you'll have to make several passes. You can't really see that, but I was cutting out a little heart because I love you guys. But you'd have to make several passes to get that to cut out, okay? All right, so let's talk about building things together. You're gonna wanna use pins and glue. So I could just take this and I could run a bead of glue See if this has even got any glue in it. Wow. There is some glue, but it's like in one big blob at the bottom. It's pretty dried out. I wonder if I've got another one here. Nope. Just thinking about it. So what I would do is just run a really thin bead of glue down this edge, and then attach it like so. Now, if I do that with glue, I could only use glue, and that would work. It would dry and it would stay together, but I would have to like hold it for 20 minutes while it dries. So instead of holding it, I'm going to use straight pins and sort of nail it together. So I'm holding this together and pushing this in. And you would want to do several.
Can we leave the straight pins in there?
Yes, leave the straight pins in there. Now that they're in there, you can set this aside and move on and keep building, or you can keep building on this and not worry about waiting for it to dry. Once it dries, it's going to be very strong. Now, it's pretty strong as it is right now, but if I'm working with this and I'm building onto it and attaching more, eventually this is going to flex back and forth a little bit, and the pins are going to start to pull out, and you're going to start to get gaps. So you want to do both. Think of it like construction adhesive and nails or bolts or something. You need both in order to make this strong. Don't skip the glue. You'll regret it later as you're building and it becomes bigger and more complex. Okay? So, foam board is interesting in that it's pretty strong in some ways. It's very lightweight and easy to build with. It's just a strip here. But I can bend it this way and you can see it's got some flex to it. And if I bend it too much, it breaks, right? So it's not real strong this way. It's very strong this way. I have to put quite a bit of force on it before it breaks that way. So in order to make it stronger, what we do is combine things and join them together in different angles. So if this is strong this way and not that way, I put these together and now it's strong in both ways. This is the way I-beams are made in, steel construction buildings, right? You've seen girders that are this sort of I-beam construction, right? Very strong. This, we can't really, if I glued this and put it together, it would be hard to break if I bend it either way. I'd have to put a lot more force on it. So even just combining two pieces together makes something stronger. You can make entire columns this way. If I had 4 that were cut equally, I could combine them together and make a rectangular column, and I could make a bunch of these, and these could become building structures. Just having 2 together though, kind of an angle iron like I had before, is going to add some strength. If we're making columns, we don't have to make them completely square. We could make round columns too. It's a little trickier. What I've done with this piece is I've just cut through part way. I haven't cut all the way through. I've only cut through the top surface and part way through the foam board. And I made several passes, so it's basically not cut through on this side, but it can bend now. So I could bend this up into a circle, and you can see once you've scored it, you kind of bend it and it cracks a little bit. And then it becomes flexible, right? You can bend it. So I could do this. It's really kind of hard to glue that together and pin that together, but I can attach this to a surface at the top and bottom, and then this becomes very durable, right? Very strong. So there's different kind of joints that we can do. The first is called a butt joint. My 6-year-old son was here. He would be laughing right now. But we're just talking about butting 2 things up against each other adjacent. And that's really what I did with this first one that I built a minute ago, where I stuck the 2 pieces together, right? It's the edge of one plane just comes up to the other, and you've got them coming together at that corner. We can also make mitered joints, which are a little bit cleaner, but are a little bit trickier to build. So let me cut one of these. Now, instead of cutting this straight through here, I'm going to cut it at an angle. And I'm going to try to get this at about a 45-degree angle from vertical. That's where a small 45-degree triangle comes in handy. You can kind of use it as a guide to just kind of give yourself a sense of what that angle is. Now, if I cut that, I've got, instead of a straight angle, I've got an angled angle. That makes a lot of sense, right? But when these come together and I glue and pin, I would pin through from this side and I would pin through from that side. And what you'll end up with is a much cleaner corner because you don't see the exposed foam on the corner. If you guess wrong, you end up with something that's a little bit off from 45. Sometimes you might want something different, but you just have to keep that in mind. So we can make mitered joints as well. We can make slot and tab kind of joints. Which you have to plan a little more carefully for. So I've made a little tab here, and I should do this with a pencil, but instead I'm just kind of holding it up there to mark the size of it. And I'm cutting out a little tab for it to fit into, a little slot for the tab to fit into. Now, when this happens, by the way, and you don't cut all the way through, what do you do? Do you yield to the temptation to just grab this and pull it off? No, because you end up with little torn, frayed edges. Instead, lay it back down and cut it completely, right? So that can fit together in a different way. If I'm a little more careful about this, making the tab the length of the thickness, it fits together pretty cleanly. It doesn't have to be on the edge. I can cut through right in the middle of the plane and make my slot there as well. Here when I cut, I'm kind of like slicing right through, just pushing through. So I can do that, right? And then I could pin through from the back side. What if I wanted to attach to a ground plane some things here? Let's go back to this other one I had. And I want that to be attached in this way and stand up in the middle of the surface. Let me zoom in a little bit here. How do I know if I want it to be in a very specific place that I'm going to get it in the right place? Here's what I would do. I would very lightly draw kind of the footprint of this with a pencil. So I know where it attaches. And then, so you can see, right? I'm going to pierce through with the pin. I'm sort of like pre-drilling holes. So you can see the little holes. And the important thing is you can see them from the back side. So what I would do is lay down a bead of glue here and then take my piece, put it back in place, and then I can pin through from the back side and get it attached where it needs to be without missing and without the pins showing through. If I'm careful here and slow down a little bit and get it right where I want it to be, right? And then I just repeat, hit all those holes that you can barely see. Anyway, so a couple of things to think about when you're doing this. You want to be really careful so that the pins go straight in and they don't pierce through the side, right? So this is good and this is bad. It's actually, the words are written on there backwards for you guys, but get the idea. They're fine? They're just backwards on the little screen I'm seeing. All right, same kind of thing as you're cutting. You want a nice clean edge. You don't want to use a dull blade and tear it through and get this rough edge, okay? That would not be good. So you can work with geometric shapes, you can work with organic shapes. You should note sort of the difference and how it feels. Again, with curves, use a new blade, use a sharp blade in order to get a good curve. And you might be thinking, okay, so we're building with planes, isn't this gonna automatically be very geometric? And it doesn't have to be. We can take these flat shapes and we can cut arcs that curve. But, all right, so it moves this way, but it's still very flat this way. It doesn't have to be. We could cut a series of arcs and combine them together to create something that's not flat. I could pin these on here. That was a nice sound, wasn't it? You like that. And I could attach these this way, and I could start to create a curving kind of space or a void here, a volume, different ways. But it's still flat this way, right? Well, just the way that we curled up the column, you can do that with larger pieces too. Let's say I want to have like a vertical structure, a vertical wall in my sculpture. I'm going to score through, not all the way through. And I could flip it over. Etc. I should be doing this with a ruler so these are straight and even, but now I can make this bend. Wow, somebody dropped something up above us. Make it bend that way. So I could have undulating, curving arcs and planes and things like that. I could do that in both ways. Say I've got this that curves in one direction, and then I score it in this way and break those edges. So now it can curve this way and it can curve that way, right? So you can make pretty organic things if you kind of think outside the box. Here's a strip that I cut and scored at an angle, and as I bend that, I can turn it into a spiral, kind of a helix shape. So I could stand it up this way and it could spiral around. How do you hold that in place? It just, right, it's not very structurally sound, it's pretty floppy. Well, if I took another arc and combined that idea that I was using before and pinned through, that will hold it rigid, it will hold its shape. You can make curving spires and you can build with those in different ways too. So the next little section on the handout there says support structures, buttresses, props, and other connectors. Let's say I have something really tall here. Zoom back out again here. I guess that's as far out as I can go. Maybe I want to make connections between things to make them stand up. Think here a little bit. It may be necessary sometimes to create pieces that aren't really shaped symbolically in any way, but maybe they're just support structures. Still though, you want to consider the design of these little support structures. I mean, I could stick that on there and it makes this much less floppy once I attach it, but this thing could be designed geometrically or organically or any way you want to kind of stylistically blend into your sculpture, okay? So what if we want to give some of these planes some thickness? We want to combine these together so that they're not flat. We could build a cube. I could make this a completely enclosed object and it would be more of a mass and have more volume and more visual presence. It doesn't have to just be flat planes like this, right? In this case, I didn't enclose it entirely. I've got 4 planes, a top and a bottom, one that goes through, one that goes halfway through. And I've implied a cube-like space, but it's still incorporating, or a cube-like form, but it's still incorporating space. And the light is catching it on different angles and sort of activating the space, okay? So I think that's helpful to think about how planes come together to build 3-dimensional objects and whether or not those objects have to be completely enclosed, like a box, for example, in this form, or not. So the idea is that volumes and spaces can be, and masses can be implied by, we don't need all 6 sides of this to make this cube shape. We can give things more mass also just by stacking these things up. Let me take that off. Actually, that's been glued. That's not coming off. Take this pin out so I don't stab myself in the hand. By the way, as we're doing this, feel free to ask any questions you have about these materials. Yeah.
So you're talking about like the way like you were making like a little like head and then you like cut it out on one side and like put it together. Could we slot the pieces like 2 like big planes, like slot them together?
Yes.
I didn't know if like that was allowed, or if something that was like allowed.
Yeah, pretty much anything's allowed. And there's probably an example here somewhere of the pieces coming together in that way. Actually, I've got one right here. Here's a little structure that I built that is, it's not glued or pinned, it's just held together through slot and tab construction. It's 6 of these. Yep, 6 of those. Right. I'm going to show you this in a little while. It's going to blow your mind. So remember this. The interesting thing about this form is, well, I think it's just kind of structurally interesting with these repetitions of this sort of rhythm that's created. But I think the space of it is interesting as well. But it really wasn't anything except just a box-like shape I made. I'll show you some more with that in a little bit. But yeah, slot and tab construction this way, right? That's fine too. So another way that you can build is to stack up the planes to create more mass. Rather than building a box per se. What's that? That could create progressive rhythm. Good observation. Right, so I do this and it starts to look vaguely pyramid shaped, but if I do this on both sides, building out, and these are square, but they could be circular, I could build out smaller and smaller circles on both sides, and I could make a sphere in this kind of technique, right? Okay.
Couldn't you also make a sphere by slotting it?
You could, yeah. Actually, let me cut a couple of circles real quickly here. Whoops. There's other ways to imply spheres too, which I'll show you in just a second. Let's cut one of these up. Notice when I'm cutting a curve, I'm really swinging my whole elbow around as I cut. And if you draw this out, you're going to end up with much closer to a circle than I ended up with there. The thing about slot and tab construction that you need to remember is the width of the slot needs to be pretty much equal to the width of the board itself. So what I would do if I was really doing this is I would lay that down and I would draw on both sides of it and get that measurement translated on there. So